Welcome. Now, I am imagining that you're here with me because I'm used to working with either people in the room or people on Zoom, and I'm recording this by myself. So I'm just going to imagine that you're there and that you're listening and that you're interested in what I'm going to say. I hope you find the next 40 minutes useful and an opportunity to reflect on parental conflict and the impact it has on children. We're going to be thinking about parents and couples. And just to start with, it's really to give you a bit of a warning. Some of this can be quite triggering. We all have experience of our parents. We may well be in a relationship. So just to be aware and to manage your own expectations, you bring your own experience, and we will be thinking about domestic violence and abuse. And we're working in that grey area between parental conflict and domestic abuse, and this is a challenge. So today's task is about bringing research, evidence, and practice together, which will hopefully make a difference to how we think about parental conflict and how a child experiences their parents' relationship, whether those parents are together or separated. I want to acknowledge that we're working in hard times. For parents and children and young people, it's a dynamic time. And it seems at the moment the only thing that is constant is the change that's around us. We will be thinking about whether there is anything that can make this easier for us and for the parents we're working with. It's important that we check in with ourselves. How are we doing? Do we need a break? And how are we feeling? So, today we'll be thinking about parental conflict and what it is. What is its impact on children? You'll be thinking about your own context and what this means for you when you think about parental conflict. We'll be thinking about some strategies for starting a conversation with parents, thinking about some tools to work with, and some ongoing practice development. The objectives for this session are to recap on the definitions and evidence about parental conflict and its impact on children, to give you a chance to use this lens to reframe some of the work that you're already doing and to give you a chance to explore some ways and approaches to maybe do things slightly differently and to think about how you can develop your own practice in this area going forward. It's all about relationships. And if it's all about relationships, why on earth is this so difficult for us? Let's think about that. What is a partner for? So if you're in a relationship, what's your partner for? It's probably best to acknowledge that how you answer this today might be different to how you answer it tomorrow. Here are some ideas just to get you thinking about it. Having a partner might be so that you're known and you know someone, so you can share and support each other, that you might want to embark on a new project together. You've got somebody who has your back, somebody to laugh with, somebody to be affectionate with, and also to receive affection and attention. It's important to say right at the beginning that we're thinking and considering about working relationally, but it's not about marriage or heterosexuality or any other normative arrangement. It's really about the quality of the relationship. The quality of the co-parenting relationship affects every aspect of a child's life. The mental health of individual parents and parenting styles affects childhood outcomes. How we are able to work and live in the world is impacted by our childhood experience of our parents' relationship. Co-parenting relationships have an effect on children and young people's attainment, on their behaviour, on the wider family and peer relationships, and on our children's mental health as they grow up into adolescence and into adulthood. The co-parenting relationship also affects our children and young people's choice of partner later in life. So we're going to start with some of the evidence. What is the evidence telling us? The key findings include something around the quality of the interparental relationship and how parents communicate and relate to each other. Parental communication is interestingly recognised as a primary influence on effective parenting practices and children's long-term mental health and future life chances. So if we think about that just for a minute, how we're communicating as parents has a long-term impact on our child's mental health and their life chances. What does this mean for your practice? What do we have to do now we know this? So just stop for a moment. I want you to think about an example from your work where interparental conflict adversely affected a child or a young person you know. How did this show up? What is the impact of the conflict on you as a practitioner? Why don't you press pause on the video just for a couple of moments? If we were in the room together, we would actually be getting you into small groups to think about this together. Great. So I hope that was useful. It's interesting to stop for a moment. What are your reflections on you as a practitioner? What did it bring up for you? What did it stir from your own experience? Or just in terms of seeing something unfolding in front of you? So what else does the evidence tell us? Parents and couples who engage in frequent, intense and poorly resolved interparental conflict put children and young people's mental health and life-term chances at risk. And when we think about this, we can see the compelling evidence in the attached report. On the slides next to me, there is a hyperlink, and it links to the Early Intervention Foundation report. If you want to have a look at that, it's all there, and I'm just highlighting 2 or 3 of those key findings for you to have a think and sort of think about your practice. If we know that frequent, intense and poorly resolved conflict has a long-term, lifetime impact on children and young people's mental health and their opportunities, what does this mean? Should we be intervening earlier? If it is earlier, at what point should this be? Should it be at the point of adolescence as young people form relationships? Or is it at a point of perinatal support? At what point do we start to look after that relationship? There are a number of tools I'll be mentioning during this presentation that we can use to help us to think about relationships. And here is an example. Take a moment to think about your own relationship. If you're not in a relationship, think about a couple you know, a family member or friends. You could do this with your partner if you want to, and see how you answer and how your partner answers the questions. And you can rate yourself. There are 5 questions for you to have a look at. Just think about your relationship. Could you use this tool with parents? Could it become part of your assessment and how you work with parents? Whether they're coming to an early help centre, it's a case conference, or whether it's just a drop-in. At Tavistock Relationships, we are thinking about parental conflict all of the time, when we're working with parents and at every point. The challenge for us all is to embed this thinking into our work with parents, wherever we're meeting a parent and at whatever point in their lives, so it just becomes part of our work. So back to the evidence. What else is it telling us? Children of all ages can be affected by destructive interparental conflict. And it's evidenced across infancy, childhood, adolescence, and even into adulthood. Babies as young as 6 months have an elevated heart rate when they hear their parents arguing. This physiological experience shows the stress that they're experiencing. And when they were put in front of adults other than their parents, and they listened to them arguing, their heart rates were not elevated. So what does this mean for our practice? What does it mean for our assessments? If we know that parental conflict adversely affects a child throughout their whole life, we now know how important this is. There's another piece of evidence that's important to consider. The context of the wider family is important and can protect or make things worse for a child. Levels of negativity and parenting practice can exacerbate or moderate the impact of interparental conflict. So really, it's not just about parents, but it's also what's going on around them. If there are elevated levels of negativity between parents and grandparents and the extended family, this will have an adverse effect. If parenting practices are highly authoritarian, this will impact the child's long-term outcomes. So let's consider this. What does this mean for our practice? What outcomes should we work for? Do children's services capture and map the whole family picture? Do we think systemically? Are we trauma-informed, or are we just interested in child outcomes? One final thing that we're going to think about in terms of the evidence is the fact that interparental conflict can adversely affect both the mother-child and the father-child relationship, with evidence suggesting that the association between interparental conflict and negative parenting practices may be stronger for the father-child relationship compared to the mother-child relationship. Often, when families are presenting in a children's centre, we will be working with just the mother. When we think about who's on the books and who's turning up, we realise we may not know the father. We don't know if he's there or if he's not. And what do we make of this? Do we need to be making more of a targeted effort to work with fathers and engage fathers? Should we be seeking out dads, listening to their experiences and keeping them in mind when we're developing our own services? More broadly, we have to hold in mind the family relationships and the life cycle and all the possible fractures and transitions. Just to say, marriage is not a necessity. For many families, this diagram is the pattern of their lives and their parents' lives and possibly their children. But of course, not all families look like this. I want us to think about when things can go wrong. It is often at the points of transition. This might be the birth of a baby, or as adolescents make their own way. There are times of transition and potential fracture. Are our services built around these life transition times? Are we engaging with people for the whole lifetime relationship, or are we just targeting services at certain points without giving attention to the whole lifelong experience of transition? When we're thinking about parental conflict and domestic abuse, it's important to think about the grey space between what is conflict, what's abuse, and how do we work here. To be clear, we're working below the threshold of domestic abuse. And we need to recognise locally agreed tools and agencies who help to determine whether there is domestic abuse or interparental conflict within a relationship. If you have concerns about domestic abuse, you follow those local procedures. Working with conflict requires continued vigilance. Understanding the difference between conflict and domestic abuse is not a fixed thing, and it's not a continuum. We need to be alert to the emergence of domestic abuse. What one week might be a high level of conflict, next week may be moving towards a domestic abusive relationship. It's really important that we have open and honest conversations about the cases that we're working with. What are we worried about? And what are the risks of the work that we're doing? We must recognise it is a grey space. And at Tavistock Relationships, we're really interested in that grey space, and we'll be very happy to think with you about this in your local context. When co-parents are agitated and frustrated in their own relationship, they're more likely to be distressed or aggressive in their roles as parents. There is a robust association between levels of conflict in the interparental relationship and levels of conflict in the parent-child relationship. Indeed, there's even some evidence to suggest that father-child relationship is more sensitive to interparental conflict. And these factors appear to be irrespective of whether the relationship is genetic, biological, or not. So So again, thinking about our own practice, how do we create services with this in mind? Next, we're going to be thinking about population groups that may be at greater risk of experiencing parental conflict. I'm sure most of you will know this, but we've put a list together that is a resource that you can come back to. We know that for parents where there is alcohol dependency, and for parents who have a disabled child or a child with a special educational need, there are greater risks of the parents experiencing poor mental health and there being higher levels of parental conflict. For families that are already working with early help and specialist safeguarding services, they are more likely to experience risk factors such as poor housing, financial difficulties, and again, poor mental health. When families are living in areas of high deprivation, they're more likely to experience risk factors, including poor housing, financial difficulties, and again, poor mental health. Some ethnic minority families have greater risk of experiencing poor mental health and therefore parental conflict. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender parents are at greater risk of experiencing poor mental health. Teenage parents are also at greater risk in terms of financial difficulties and poor mental health. And we've talked about those times of transition. At those points of transition, there's a greater risk of poor mental health. For example, first-time parents, parents of children who are transitioning to school, and parents who are separating. Through this whole list, we can see parental mental health and parental conflict are intrinsically linked. Being well in ourselves and not being well in ourselves impacts how we relate to our co-parents. So why don't we run towards parental conflict with a fire axe and a bucket to help? Can we do that? We can, but often we're really squeamish about doing it. We've got concerns about privacy and intrusion. We don't really want to ask. We find it just a bit embarrassing and a bit too close to home. Often there's anxiety about us and others. The veil is at its thinnest because we're in a relationship. We know it's hard. We've had that row before we go to work. And mostly, we really don't know how to have that conversation. We might not have it with our friends and our family. So how on earth do we have it with the parents that we're working with? In our culture, it may be a taboo. It might be better to shut up and put up. And this training is about becoming aware of all of this and being brave. We all have common relationship troubles. And what do your children see? What do children understand and at what stage? What do children imagine is going on? People come to Tavistock relationships for a number of reasons. And common reasons might include jealousy, envy, infidelity, gambling, alcohol, drug misuse, violence, abuse, life events, maybe a lack of passion, no one's holding the rope between the couple, a lack or a poor communication, a lack of interest, respect, attention, and emotional investment, and a lack of balance or equity, and a lack of hope that things can change, and that sense of just growing apart and being different, and the possibility of the relationship feeling unsafe or insecure. So let's think about the things that we argue about most. If you're a parent, think about the things that you argue about most with your co-parent, whether you're together or whether you're separate. Just write down the top 3. So just pause, write down those 3 things. If you're not a parent, what do you think are the most sort of important things that couples argue about? So just take a moment, again, maybe write that down, your top 3. Let's see if we agree. What are the things that we're arguing about most? S. What does S stand for? Sex. Who initiates sex? How often? Who likes what? What's good? What's not? H. Housework. Who takes the bins out? Who unloads the dishwasher? Who puts the washing? Who puts the towels back on the towel rail? I'm getting a bit carried away with those. A, activities. Who does what when? Who goes out on a Thursday night? Who has the children? Who goes out on a Saturday night? Who looks after the children on Sunday morning? M is for money. Who spent what when? How much? How much? There's no hiding when you've got that banking app. And finally, E. E is for employment. Who's doing what when? Whose job's most important? What does that job mean for where you live, how you live your life, and how you relate to your extended family? These are the things that we're all arguing about. Plus, for those who are parents, we'll often argue about most things relating to parenting. Our own experience of how we were parented hugely impacts how we're going to parent. We may well not have discussed the faith of our child before we have the child. We might not have discussed whose name the child should have after the baby is born, or even the language that we want our child to speak. There's so much here to navigate, and it can be hard going. Our children experience our conflict. No child is too young, if you remember those 6-month-old babies. Louis, age 8, says, "My mum and dad spend so much time hating each other, they don't have time to love me." And Melanie says, and she's 5, "They aren't shouters, they don't talk at all unless I'm there to make them talk, especially if I break a rule by saying I don't eat or give me something else, please." And Leonard, age 14, says, "It's been like this for years. I think I'm used to it, but I've got a little brother and he doesn't understand why our family doesn't feel like other families." And Shakira, age 14, "It's when she picks up her phone and she sighs and rolls her eyes, I know it's my dad. I'd pay a lot of money to stop that. She just forgets that I love my dad too, and I'm stuck right in the middle trying to make it okay for them both." This is the voice of the child. The child's perspective is really key in our work at Tavistock Relationships. Having the child in mind is central to our thinking. Children shouldn't have to be the ones that carry out the emotional work between their parents, but they often have to. We don't really want to talk to parents about this as practitioners. It's private and it's personal. It could feel dangerous. We're wondering if there's domestic abuse and violence. One practitioner said, "It's like quicksand, it's boggy, and it gets up to your neck before you know it." We don't know how to. We might feel like it's really not important. We don't work with couples and we don't want to promote marriage. What does this mean for same-sex relationships? We might be worried about making things worse. And if we talk about it, we might feel ill-equipped, and actually that parent might need a counsellor or a therapist. That is a long list of reasons why we don't. But as I've said before, we need to be brave. We need to think about how to intervene. We need to think about what we're seeking to do and how will we do it. How do we start a conversation? What holds us back? We're trying to help parents improve the communication, trust, and balance in their relationship, whether they're together or whether they're separate. And they could have been separated for years and still need balance and that perspective that you can bring as a practitioner. So what strategies can we have as practitioners that we can use to embed into our work? Firstly, be brave and make time. We can use resources to stimulate reflection and normalise. Have a go and practice. Practice having a conversation about relationships with the people around you, your family and your friends. Try being honest and transparent. You can simply say you've noticed that things seem difficult at the moment, that maybe you've got some concerns. It can be a simple question as, how are things between you? You might get absolutely nothing, so you might have to try again and actually sit in that moment of uncomfortable silence. The essential skills to develop and use are active listening, curiosity, and playing back what you've heard. Making a bit of space and actually sitting with that uncomfortable feeling yourself. You're not going to fix things. You can encourage reflection and think about the perspective of the parent and reflect and repeat back, working collaboratively with the parents at a speed that they can manage. And importantly, look after yourself. If this is hard for you because of your past or current relationships, then talk to somebody about it. Talk to your supervisor. And if you haven't got a supervisor, ask for some supervision. Going back to the start of that list, it's about being brave, having a go and sitting with uncomfortable feelings, staying somehow in that boggy place. Here are some questions that you can ask yourself. You can get a link in the hyperlink to this page and just answer this really quickly. You can answer it for yourself, or you could use it with a parent that you're working with. Don't take too long to think about it. Just answer the first thing that comes to mind in a really quick way. And finally, we're going to think about some tools to work with. You've watched this session, you've got in mind parental conflict, you've thought about the evidence, and you've thought about some of those parents and children that you know that you're working with, and you're converted, and now you are thinking about what comes next. What tools have we got? Talk to Me are cards to help parents communicate. If we can communicate more clearly with the people we love and live with, this is the best part of the answer to some of the problems and conflicts that we have. These cards help parents to have a repairing conversation, encouraging parents to be able to say something that they might find difficult to say. They help improve listening skills, and they're an excellent resource. And you can work out how best to use them with the parents that you're working with. In terms of your own practice development, there are all sorts of resources and website materials. There's a whole wealth of thinking and research into parental conflict. So make use of these, build your own resources. Have your local authority establish a network of champions. Please do join in the conversation and be part of the thinking and the learning. Embed your own reflective practice, so that understanding parental conflict is just part of the way that you live and work. Before we go, think about this couple, Tony and Liz with baby Eliza. Not much sleep, not much work, some depression, no support, lots of anxiety, and a lot of colic. How would you have the conversation? Could you have a conversation? How would it be? Just take a moment to think about them. Can you practice by yourself, sitting there with the uncomfortable feeling of asking a challenging question? Can you observe, play back what you see in front of you, saying, it looks like this is really hard for you both at the moment? So to finish, now you know about the evidence, you can't unknow it. There is compelling research about the effect parental conflict has on children and young people. Early intervention in parental relationships will have a profound impact on children's childhood outcomes and beyond. To most questions, love and work are the good part of an answer. We can repair, mend, and patch our relationships, and being good enough really is good enough. I encourage you to be good enough in your practice. If you found this information useful and helpful, and you want to go to our website to see a bit more about the work of Tavistock Relationships, please do. You can find it at tavistock relationships.org. Thank you for listening and for getting to the end.